Hi, everyone, and welcome to Quests by Community. I'm Ricky Spencer, and today we are going to deep dive everything into the current referendum for the voice and also having a really deep understanding of the role of Reconciliation Victoria. It is my absolute pleasure that we have today Professor Andrew Gunstone, who is the inaugural Associate Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Reconciliation at Federation University and lead to the reconciliation and RAP matters across the university. They have also recently established the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, which provides national and regional leadership on academic, industry, and community understandings and engagements in these most important areas. He has also recently appointed three senior Indigenous professors to the centre, and the National Centre is conducting a series of dialogues across all campuses during National Reconciliation Week so that everyone can get a really deep understanding of the First Nations voice to Parliament. He is also the co-chair of Reconciliation Victoria, and he works closely with Reconciliation Australia International RAP Leadership Group. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you, Andrew. How do you fit everything in?
Thank you very much for having me, Ricky. It's delight to be here. And it's been very busy, particularly the last few months with the referendum. And I've been doing a lot of talks around Australia on the referendum. But I've been really invigorated by the extraordinary level of support the community has on the First Nations voice to Parliament. And really excited to be here today and talk a bit more about this critical moment in Australia's reconciliation journey.
One thing that I'm so excited to really have a real kind of have a chat about is understanding what is Reconciliation Victoria and why is it in an important space? So let's start there.
Reconciliation Australia is the national reconciliation organisation that leads reconciliation across the country, and there are state and territory branches that engage with Reconciliation Australia. So I've got the privilege of co-chairing Reconciliation Victoria with my co-chair, Uncle Shane Charles, and we've got a tremendously engaged board as well as cultural council and also some amazing dedicated staff led by CEO Nicole Finley. And so the role of Reconciliation Victoria is to promote reconciliation across the state and work closely with the other state and territory organisations and with Reconciliation Australia to help lead the nation's reconciliation journey. So we found certainly our work's been ramped up this year, particularly with the Voice to Parliament, as we have many local groups around the state wanting to engage in this important initiative. The Reconciliation Victoria also has 29 local reconciliation groups spread across the states. They're doing some fantastic work on the ground within their own communities, promoting the importance of reconciliation as well.
How does Reconciliation Victoria, how does that thread through with the voice to Parliament?
It can certainly get confusing with all these different reforms. I mean, I see that this current time of our national journey, there's some really significant momentous changes occurring. So, from a Victorian point of view, we've already implemented as a state or are implementing the three components of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So, taking a step backwards, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was created in May 2017 by 250 Indigenous delegates at Uluru. But those 250 delegates were representative of many hundreds of Indigenous communities across Australia through a whole range of regional dialogues held right throughout each of the state and territories. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a beautifully evocative statement. I really encourage your listeners to read that statement. It's a very generous invitation to the Australian people to walk together to a chain, voice, treaty and truth. Now, whilst we're focusing very much at the moment on the voice at a federal level, it's interesting to see in Victoria has led the way. And so we've already got voice and developing treaty and truth at a state level. So we have the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, which is the state equivalent of the voice. And that's just had its second election cycle. And they're doing some tremendous work in engaging with Victorian government on the importance of developing a series of treaties or a treaty across the state or local treaties to look at what can be included in that. And so that's the treaty part of it, the agreement making part of it. And then, of course, the third part is the Uluru Justice Commission, which is Australia's first truth telling commission. It has all the powers of a royal commission, and they're doing some outstanding work at the moment in talking to politicians, talking to bureaucrats about some key issues of truth telling, both in the past but also in the present today. So the state's really leading the way across Australia in terms of those voice treaty truth components. Now, in terms of the national part, what the Uluru Statement calls for is a First Peoples voice to Parliament, but also for a Makarrata Commission to be established to address the issues of truth telling and agreement making. And that hasn't been created yet, but the Albanese government has committed to looking at that in this term of Parliament. But the focus at the moment is on the First Nations voice to Parliament. That's important for people to understand that's a national issue. But the First Nations voice to Parliament will look at having a voice, but then that will be supported potentially by local and regional voices as well.
What will Australia look like the day after the referendum if the voice to Parliament gets through?
I think it'll be a tremendous time for Australia. Just to sort of recap a bit about why there is need for a First Nations voice to Parliament. So in 1967, the Australian Constitution was changed to remove two racist sections. So one of the sections which many people know about is the fact that up till that point, the census that was conducted at an Australian level was not allowed to include Indigenous people in the census. So that was a very racist section that was abolished. And then the second part was the federal government was able to make laws for any Australians except for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So again, that racist section was struck out of the Constitution. So that happened in 1967. So from that moment on, the federal government did have powers to make laws for Indigenous peoples. But in the 56 years since, there's been a succession of Indigenous national organisations established by federal governments, of both Labor and Liberal, over the years, only for those very same governments or subsequent governments to abolish those bodies when they just didn't like their advice. So the idea of enshrining a voice to Parliament in the Constitution is just to ensure that governments of the day can't arbitrarily just dismiss bodies at their whim. And so this is to ensure as a constant and consistent voice to government. And why that's important, and I can explain this from my 25 years plus working in academia, is that I've had the absolute privilege of working with Indigenous communities on a number of reciprocal and self-determining projects over many years. And those projects have demonstrably had better outcomes because of the involvement from Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. So many decades of academic research and policy analysis, both in Australia and internationally, clearly show that when policies or programs or practices are developed in genuine consultation with Indigenous peoples, they're demonstrably more successful. And that's clearly obvious for anyone thinking about if you're developing policies with any group, obviously including those members of that group in the development of the policy will make them more effective. So that's simply what the Voice to Parliament referendum is all about. If you cut out all the noise and the confusion, it's about recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution, and it's about listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's not, there's a lot of myths out there. It's not a third chamber. It doesn't have a veto power. It's just providing a voice for Aboriginal people to make representations to government, like many other voices have. We have trade union movements, we have big businesses, we have education bodies. There's many, many voices going already to government. This is simply saying there's going to be a constitutionally enshrined voice from First Nations to Parliament, and they'll be able to make representations. The government of the day doesn't have to agree or accept it, but they have to listen, and that's all the referendum's about.
How many people do you envisage to be appointed to this new space if the voice to Parliament is um, overwhelmingly accepted?
That's a really good point you ask. And one of the things that there's a lot of confusion about in the Australian community is many people expect all these details to be ready. But if you have a look at the Constitution, it's a very thin document and it just sets out what the principles are. So a good example is Social Security. It has a short paragraph on that there should be a Social Security system in this country, but it doesn't say where the Social Security officers are at or what type of payments are going to be offered or what the current rate is doing. All that detail, as it rightly should be, is set by Parliament of the day. And that means it can change. So obviously the Social Security benefits that were available in the 1950s will have changed to today, depending on what the needs of the communities are. So similarly with the voice, there will be a constitutional question posed to the Australian people to have the principle of a voice put into the Constitution, and then the Parliament will consult with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders and the wider community in deciding how that will form. So it clearly can't have a lot of detail because that's not how a constitution works. However, if people are interested in seeing the detail, there is many reports going back to 2012 when the Gillard government commissioned the report in 2010, and there's multiple reports that provide huge amounts of detail about what a voice could look like. And there's a 270-page report that was produced by Professors Calmer and Langton a couple of years ago that details a whole range of ways in which a national, local, and regional voices can operate. So there's a lot of detail how it could work, but ultimately it'll be the palm of the day that sets that process, just like it does for any other part of the Constitution. And I forgot to add, Ricky, in answer to your previous question, how will it look like after the vote? I'm very confident it will succeed. And I think it'll be a massive watershed moment for reconciliation in this country. I think there's been a whole range of processes in the last 20, 30 years that are leading to genuine constitutional recognition. I should add that this constitution is 122 years old and is never recognised and still doesn't recognise the oldest continuing culture on the face of this planet, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And so it's overdue, well overdue, that this constitution recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the constitution. And so I think this will be a huge mark for reconciliation as the Australian community can reconcile some critical elements about truth telling in this country. But it'll also have a massive implication, a massive impact on closing the gap and addressing a whole range of housing. And I noticed the Minister, Linda Burney, talking recently about the importance of looking at housing, employment, education, and health. And these are all contained in the closing the gap targets. And those closing the gap targets are not succeeding because generally this policy is being developed by non-Indigenous bureaucrats in Canberra, where having a First Nations voice will involve Indigenous peoples in the development of these policies and critically involving Indigenous peoples on the ground. So if there's an issue to be worked out in Alice Springs, then you'll be involving Indigenous people from Alice Springs in the development of that policy, as it should be. And again, I reiterate that whilst this hasn't been done at a national constitutional level before, it's been done for decades at policy development, and academic research has shown this conclusively here and overseas, that when these policies are developed with Indigenous peoples, they are conclusively and demonstrably more successful.
One of the things that I'm really passionate about, Andrew, is to make sure that at this moment of time, that the information that is available to people to make an informed decision is in easy read, especially for those from disability communities and those where English is an additional language. Is there provision in the current space for their campaigning that this is being addressed to make sure that everybody can have a kind of a understanding of what this will mean?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. So we're really excited that the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, which I lead and I established back in March, we've just entered into a partnership with the Victorian Government and to work with a couple of senior multicultural leaders, including Maria Dimopoulos, on a whole range of really interesting projects to engage multicultural communities, because it's really important to ensure that multicultural communities are engaged in reconciliation and looking at a whole range of key reconciliation processes about truth telling and justice. So we've got that project coming up, which we think is going to be really successful, and that's going to be a Victoria-wide project. Critically, we're going to be involving regions as well as metropolitan areas. One of the key remits of Federation University is to lead in regional areas as well. So that's going to be an area. And yes, the campaign led by Yes 23 and the Uluru Dialogues is looking at ways to engage all Australians in this process, because we think it's critical. I've been doing, as I think I mentioned earlier, I've been doing a lot of talks in the last couple of months, across Australia, and I've never found anyone who's come up. No one's ever come up to me afterwards and said, I'm going to vote no. Everyone's come up and said, look, I wasn't sure, and now I'm going to vote yes. So we're really confident when people hear the simplicity of this policy proposal, which is just about recognising and listening, people understand that there's a lot of myths out there, but once they understand what those myths are all about and very confusing processes, and once they understand that, they're very supportive of it. So we're really keen to get the message out to every Australian, regardless of communities people are from. We really want to ensure that people learn about this. And it's important. These referendums don't come up very often. The last one we had was 24 years ago. So they don't come up very often. And we're also cognizant that only 8 out of 44 referendums have ever succeeded. People might not be aware of this, but it's a double majority required to get a referendum in this country. So you need a majority of people who are voting in the referendum to be approving it, but you also need a majority of states. So given we've got 6 states, we need 4 of the 6 states to vote yes. So it's a very high hurdle, but that's how it should be because the constitutions are a founding document and it's a key document. We also think if the constitution referendum is successful, that gives a very significant moral authority to the notion of what a voice is, in the sense that the Australian people have voted for it. And so, whilst it won't have a veto power, we think that it will then produce advice that governments do have to genuinely consider, as they should, because it's looking and listening to the advice from First Nations people.
How will this benefit for our brother boys and sister girls community? Um, will there be representation in the space for having those voices?
I think that's incredibly important, and I know that Minister Burney's already said that she wants diverse voices into the voice, and so she hasn't talked about specifically how many people, but there is gender diversity. There'll be young people, older people. There'll be geographical diversity as well. So I think it's really critically important. If we're talking about First Nations voices, we want all First Nations voices to be engaged in this space. So from my point of view, that's, I think, very incredibly important to ensure that all First Nations people are represented in this space, because this will lead to better outcomes for communities across the country.
That's really wonderful to hear. Now, the other topic that I really want to kind of sort of deep dive into, and that's your role in the National RAP Leadership Group. Can you explain to our audience what is a RAP and why are RAPs important?
RAPs, or Reconciliation Action Plans, were created in 2006, and back then there was only 6 organisations with RAPs, and it was a process and a program created by Reconciliation Australia, which I mentioned is the peak national reconciliation body. And so just 17 years later, this RAP movement has grown to 2,400 organisations. So that's an incredible increase in number of organisations. And those 2,400 organisations represent over 4 million Australians. So 4 million plus Australians work or study at a RAP organisation. So it's an incredible reach. Now, I know there has been, certainly in the past, concern that RAPs might be a ticker box exercise, but certainly RAPs are very rigorous documents. I've worked, as you mentioned, in the leadership space of RAPs for a number of years now. And research from Reconciliation Australia really clearly shows that when you look at, there's different types of surveys that are conducted. So there's one survey that's conducted called the Australian Reconciliation Barometer, which measures attitudes and understandings and support for reconciliation in the wider community, the broader Australian community. And there's another one called the Workplace Reconciliation Barometer, which measures very similar, have very similar questions, but to employees of RAP organisations. And if you look at the comparison between those two surveys, then very clearly members of RAP organisations or staff of RAP organisations are far more supportive, far more understanding, far more committed, and far more educated on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues than are the wider community. So it's a very clear positive. If you've got a good RAP, and you don't want to have a tokenistic RAP, but if you've got a RAP that actually has measurable outcomes, that is really committed to cultural safety, to Indigenous self-determination, and a whole range of other key areas such as Indigenous knowledges, then those RAPs can make substantial difference to the attitudes and knowledges and understandings of your employees. As you get high level RAPs, Reconciliation Australia expects organisations with high level and high developed RAPs to also influence their sphere of influence. So, for example, at the couple of the universities I've worked at where I've led RAPs, we have done a lot of work at those universities in looking at what our sphere of influences are and trying to engage in reconciliation in those spaces. And I should add also, the notion of reconciliation is quite an interesting notion, because when it was really first developed as a public policy back in the 1990s under the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, it was quite a vague concept, and that was deliberately structured because there was an attempt at the time to get a very strong support for reconciliation. So reconciliation was often defined as meaning many different things to many peoples, but most people saw reconciliation rightly as a way to ensure people are walking together, people are improving relationships, and there's a better relationship building between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the wider community. And so that's certainly still true today. That's a really critical component of reconciliation. But in my academic work, and along with a number of other reconciliation leaders across the country, and certainly in the work I've done over the last 7 years in leading organisational RAPs, is been to make reconciliation a much more broader concept than just improving relationships, because as important as that is, we also need to look at issues such as recognising and privileging Indigenous knowledges, recognising Indigenous rights such as self-determination, ensuring workplaces are culturally safe, and of course addressing institutional individual examples of racism and whiteness and white privilege and white fragility. So they're really critical components of any genuine reconciliation process. So that's what RAPs are about. In terms of the National RAP Network, I've had the privilege of working with Reconciliation Australia closely and other really committed RAP organisations for a number of years. And we've done a number of key national projects. The most recent one, which I thought was a really good visible demonstration of the breadth of support for the First Nations voice to Parliament, is that myself and a few others were in a working group that we were able to develop a draft statement of support for the First Nations voice to Parliament, which was ultimately adopted by 70 RAP organisations, again, very large corporate organisations, smaller community-based organisations, a good cross-section of the Australian community. And that was a very powerful campaign that was just launched last week, led by Reconciliation Australia, and just illustrates the breadth of support for First Nations voice to Parliament across this country.
I want us to now kind of talk about your space in the Federation University. And we've noticed that in the number of sometimes we get this um, maybe misinformation that a regional university doesn't have the same sort of offerings that a metropolitan university would have. Tell us a little bit about the strengths of Federation University and why people, I guess, even from our LGBTIQ community and those who are brother boys and sister girls, should consider studying at Federation University.
Thanks, Ricky. I've had the privilege of being at Federation University for about 9 months now, and so I've been really excited about being here. There's a huge commitment from the Vice-Chancellor down on developing reconciliation. So when I came across, they were very supportive in supporting my idea to establish a national centre. So I created the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice in March, and that centre is looking at regional and national leadership in these spaces. They also provided the resources for me to employ 3 Indigenous professors, and these are internationally renowned Indigenous academics, Professors Bindi Bennett, Dennis Foley, and Emma Lee, who all work across Australia and have expertise in a whole range of key Indigenous areas. So that was really exciting and really reassuring for myself for the university, not just to support my idea, but then to support it financially as well. So the university has been really supportive in this. We've also come out very strongly in endorsing the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and of course campaigning strongly for First Nations voice to Parliament. And so it's been really interesting to look at this, and there's a breadth of campuses across Victoria. I noticed in the introduction you talked about we did some campus dialogues, and that was my idea a few months ago, which we've now done. I sort of didn't think at the time about how many campuses we do have, but we've got campuses in Gippsland and Horsham, Ballarat, in Brisbane, and of course we've got a metropolitan campus in Berwick here in Melbourne. So we did over the space of a couple of weeks some fantastic dialogues on the voice at each of these locations, and together we got hundreds of community members as well as staff and students coming along to those dialogues, which is really exciting. And what we also like to do is we actually got all those dialogues had panels consisting of myself and Indigenous leaders, all based at the university, either in the National Centre or elsewhere in the university. So we've made videos for those, and links I think will be provided at the end of this seminar to talk about people can actually get copies of those resources. But in terms of your broader questions, I've been really impressed by the breadth of subjects that the university does offer across a whole range of different areas. They've obviously got strong regional expertise and commitment to the regions they serve. But there's also some, broad key areas, particularly nursing and health, education, which is obviously at a regional level is important, but also at a national level as well. So they've got some really strong commitments there. And the university, I think like most universities, is also very strongly committed to supporting LGBTIQA students. And obviously, the last couple of years, particularly with some incredibly damaging homophobic and transphobic attacks on young people, including the religious freedom bills and obviously the various rallies that have been held recently. It's just been appalling. I think universities particularly in regional universities where we're obviously supporting regional towns. But all universities have a real obligation, in my view, to ensure that making sure all students, including LGBTIQ students, are welcome at the universities, and to try to stand up and reject some of this appalling bigotry that's been occurring in the last few years.
And one of the things that in my work in university spaces that I'm really impressed with spaces like Federation University is that because the campuses are a little bit smaller than metropolitan universities, there's more of a personal relationship that students and their teaching staff can develop and a sense of community. Did you want to sort of add to that?
My sort of work I'm doing, obviously in reconciliation, we found that really important. What I've done to address the diversity of the campuses that we've got is we've created reconciliation groups at each of the campuses, which I think really plays into what you're saying, Ricky, about the importance of that community engagement. So we've got reconciliation groups at each of our campuses where staff and students are involved, and they've obviously got the closest links into local communities as well. So that really adds to the strength of a regional university, of that close engagement with communities that they're serving as well. So that's just one example, and there's a lot of others that the university is very much engaging with. Their big employers in the regions. They're very committed to regional development and to looking at education and health outcomes. There's a lot of the research is focused there. Our Chancellor, Terry Moran, published a really important piece the other day talking about the importance of regional universities and their research for communities, and addressing a lot of the research areas that need to be addressed at that local level is critical as well in the nation's examination of what a university is. So regional universities play a huge role in the development of this country.
Andrew, you've taken us on quite a really informative journey into giving us a bit of a better understanding of reconciliation, truth, justice, the voice to Parliament. If people were wanting to look at more resources, we mentioned earlier before we were on live on air that Federation University has developed a really good resource for people to look at. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
What we've done is included a number of resources that we've developed ourselves. So there's the all the videos of the campus dialogues, which has really good engagement and information about what the Voice to Parliament is. But also, I found the questions are all varied, and so those questions and the answers to those questions are what I think will help educate people about what the Voice to Parliament is. So those resources are there. We also have a number of reflections from staff about what the voice means to them in very digestible 1 minute sort of packages, which I think helps educate people as well. But we also wanted to make sure we had the national campaigns and engagements in this resource list as well. So it's a one-stop shop. All the major websites are there. Yes 23, the Uluru Dialogue, as well as Reconciliation Victoria and Reconciliation Australia's pages on the Voice. We've got a number of videos, articles, podcasts, and we've also included, I thought it was really important to do this, we included 5 reports stretching back to 2012. So again, one of the myths is this, is it's a recent idea dreamt up by Anthony Albanese, but nothing could be further from the truth. And all these government reports clearly show this has been process has been discussed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait people for many years. Many government reports illustrate that, and of course, one of these reports we included was the 2021 co-design report that I referred to earlier, chaired by Marsha Langton and Tom Calmer, that visited thousands and thousands of Indigenous peoples and hundreds of communities to talk to them about what the voice means to them. So these resources, we hope, will provide some education for members of the Australian public to find ways to engage and to educate themselves, and really call out to non-Indigenous people, particularly to make sure that they educate themselves about the Voice to Parliament, and then educate their families and friends, colleagues, neighbours, members of sporting networks and so forth to do this, because we're all going to get to vote in a few months' time, and it's important that we have a really educated population as well. I also haven't talked about this in this discussion, but I've been editing. I founded the Journal of Australian Indigenous Issues 26 years ago, and so the various back copies of that journal are on that resource page as well as a upcoming edition of the journal, which will focus on the Voice to Parliament. We've got leading Indigenous and non-Indigenous campaigners for the Voice talking about why it's so important to vote. So we've got that really good resource coming up as well. And the other thing to mention is we have the inaugural Federation University annual reconciliation lecture coming up on the 13th of July. And that lecture features Noel Pearson, who's one of the leading Indigenous academics and lawyers in this country, and he's been at the forefront of constitutional reform. He's been one of the architects of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and so we're really privileged to have him speak. And that will be recorded, and once that's been recorded, we'll have that up on the resource page as well.
Professor Andrew Gunstone, it's been an absolute pleasure to really having a really deep diving conversation about what the voice to Parliament could mean for Australia. And I really want to give you the last word. For those who are watching who are still perhaps not sure, what key message would you like to leave them?
Thanks, Ricky, and I'm really delighted to have been given the opportunity to speak. I suppose the key message to leave is for non-Indigenous people out there, like myself. When I went through schooling, I only learnt at school about Ned Kelly, Don Bradman, and Farlap. I learnt nothing about Indigenous issues. It's only when I got to university that I learnt more about Indigenous issues. So I understand the truth telling in this country's got a long way to go. I understand that there's non-Indigenous people that are a bit unsure about this process, but I ask people to open up their hearts and to really read the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I believe it's a very beautiful, evocative statement. It's a generous invitation. It deliberately isn't talking to the government, it's talking to the Australian people. Open up your hearts and then open up your minds and read a bit about this information. And it's a very modest proposal, but it's a way to try to address a couple of really key, long-standing issues in this country's history. And I think it's imperative to drive us towards a reconciliation. So the other thing just to mention, Ricky, is that this is not radical on a world stage either. Many other countries have had truth-telling, have had voices to their parliament in various guises for many, many years. New Zealand has had guaranteed representation in parliament for Maoris, for the Maori electorate since the 19th century. You've got Sami parliaments with Indigenous contributions. You've got the United States and Canada having engagements as well. So there's a long way to go in this country. This is not radical by any stretch. It's just a way to find out a better way to ensure a First Nations voice to Parliament, which will lead to a whole range of better outcomes for this country.
This is Ricky Spencer, and you've been watching Quest by Community for our deep dive discussion, The Voice to Parliament.
Thanks very much, Ricky.